Hello, BookTube. Well, different sort of thing tonight, where I'm going to be discussing with Stephen, who was on during the the general election results. We're going to be on which is on the 4th of July. We're going to be discussing the sort of lay of the land of British politics since the general election. Just to set out what happened was that the Tories have been in power since 2010, first as a minority, as a coalition government with Lib Dems, and then from 2016 up until July the 4th, they were in power as a majority government. Then Labour won under Sir Keir Starmer, and I'll just share my screen so that so you can see this result. Just a second. There we go, and share screen. Hopefully it should, yeah, that's it. And this here will be the results. Oh, come on, that's it, yes. Sorry about this, it just takes time. It seems to slow the computer down when I try and share something. Here we go, so this is the results. Labour won, the Labour has 412 seats with an increase from 2019 of 211. Conservatives have gone down to their worst, the lowest number since, I think, worse than 1832, with 121 seats, a loss of 251 seats. The Lib Dems have gone up to 72 seats. That's 64 from 2019. The SNP, the Scottish National Party, have lost 39 seats, and they've gone down to 9. Sinn Féin have kept 7. Sinn Féin are the Irish Republican Party. They do not take their seats in Scotland, their seats in Parliament. And then there were 29 others. I'll just go through this. So we have 6 independents who we're going to discuss because they have had a particular, they did particularly well in Labour constituencies around the issue of Gaza. And of course, Reform UK, led by Nigel Farage, has 5 seats, though that may go up to 6 because in Northern Ireland, Jim Allister's party, Jim Allister, who leads the Traditional Unionist Voice, has been in discussions with the Reform, I believe, about taking the whip, so that might go up to 6. The Democratic Unionists lost 3 seats, but that was because of one of them went to an independent unionist supported by Reform and the Traditional Unionist Voice. The Greens have gone up 3. They've picked up a couple of seats. Plaid Cymru, which are a Scottish, I should just go back. The Green Party, that's the Green Party of England and Wales. The Green Party of Scotland is a separate party, but they didn't win any seats. Plaid Cymru is a Welsh nationalist party here. They went up 2 seats to 4. The Social Democratic Labour Party, no change in results. They are a constitutional Irish nationalist party in Northern Ireland. The Alliance Party is another Northern Irish seat, a Northern Irish party. They are technically a middle-of-the-road, non-sectarian party, but they have in recent years been leaning very much towards the nationalist Republican side. The Ulster Unionists, who are the oldest unionist party in Northern Ireland, they've gained 1 seat, and that means that they have this is the first time in over 10 years that they've had a seat in the British Parliament, and before that they'd been in Parliament since they were founded as the Ulster Unionist Council back in 1905. And then we have here the TUV, Traditional Unionist Voice, that's Jim Allister, and all the rest, no other party that I think won any seats. Just go down, no. So that's how sort of British politics, as it stands, sits with the general election results. So we'll start with the Labour Party, I think, Stephen, and Labour technically had a good night. I think we'd agree.
Yes, I think, yeah, you just can't. I mean, there's of course caveats to it, but the fact of the matter is this is an excellent result for them, and I think it's one of their best ever results. I think it didn't quite beat Blair.
No.
I don't know if I'll just check if it beat Attlee. I think it did. If I get 1945 general.
Going to double check something. Else.
Yes, he beat Attlee. But so I think this is their second best result ever.
Yeah.
So, which is not bad, given that they went from their worst result in a century in 5 years ago. So yeah, I mean, Starmer. Obviously, what that means is Starmer's authority. Starmer's authority over the party is basically just unassailable now.
Yeah.
I mean, he can't actually get rid of Angela Rayner because the deputy leader is selected by the membership. But in terms of the cabinet and everything, he is sort of lord of all he surveys.
Yeah.
However, so the caveat is that unlike in '97, the majorities are extremely thin. So it's been called the sort of the loveless landslide.
Yeah.
And the point has been made that basically the majority is a mile wide and an inch deep. I mean, it's got really wafer thin majorities. That I think is just not going to be too much of an issue for the next 2 years.
Yeah.
I think it will start to become an issue as we start getting closer to the next general election, and then also potentially, it'll depend on what the Tories and Reform do. We'll get to them later. But if there is some sort of, recovery, then I think there'll be at least 100 Labour MPs who'll start getting very skittish.
Yeah.
So then it might. So in the second half of this term, it might start having an impact. But for the next 2 years, basically, Starmer can do whatever he pleases.
Yeah. And
that's the long and short of that. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh no, it's just work on your point about the majorities. I remember during the results as they were coming in, people were talking. There was stuff coming out of the Labour Party in the north of England where they were at one point genuinely worried that they were going to lose seats to Reform. Reform was doing so well in those sort of solid Labour seats, the sort of seats where the Labour vote isn't counted so much as it's weighed.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I mean, that is, I think. Well, I suppose we could jump ahead to Reform. I mean, obviously they didn't do quite as well as the exit poll had them at. So they got 5, whereas the exit poll had them at 13.
Yeah,
I think it was. But nonetheless, that for essentially a startup party, that's an extremely good performance. But yeah, they have an interesting choice where they're going to go, because actually probably their best room for growth is actually in Labour areas, particularly in like the northeast. So the main barrier would be actually Reform is quite a sort of economically Thatcherite party. I don't know how much people really care that much about those sort of questions nowadays. I think sort of the conversation, you don't have the big unions, you don't have sort of the big sort of heavy industries we used to.
Yeah.
So I wonder if that's really the concern people think it is. I know in opinion polls, people are, tend to be quite sort of economically left wing in terms of stuff like nationalisation and so on, but they tend to not prioritise it in voting. So I don't know how much Reform will have to cater to that, but probably Labour is where they'd want to target most. Because I think if this is a big if, but if the Tories select someone like Badenoch or Jenrick or Braverman as the next leader, I think it shouldn't be too difficult for them to win back sort of the Shire Tories who broke for Reform largely this time.
Yeah.
But the sort of the Labour Reform switchers, who are about half the vote, they're probably the most. They've got the most potential for growth, I'd say. So that will be very interesting to see what Farage makes of that. The other, of course, interesting point is the one about with Labour and the SNP is that Labour have won back their red fortress in Scotland.
Yeah.
Which obviously means that's a guaranteed 30 seats if they can hold that. And it basically kills the independence question.
Yeah.
Well, I think the question was essentially dead from the moment Alistair Jack just said no to and basically just just made clear the legal reality, which is it's up to the Westminster's just been humouring the nationalists for 20 years now, nearly, and there's actually nothing that obliges them, and he's basically the UK government position can be summed up as, well, if you want your independence, then you're going to have to smuggle in some Kalashnikovs and take to the hills like everybody else has to. There's no more sort of referendums likely. But now with the SNP losing 80% of their seats, I mean that's really crippled the movement. I was disappointed that Flynn didn't lose his seat, which he came very close to. And that was made up for the fact that John Nicholson lost a seat, who I just personally dislike intensely. And he would have thought he was safe as houses before this result. So that's that's a small mercy, but that is going to have all sorts of impact. I mean, it means they're kicked off the third party status, which means they don't get the media coverage of their questions. They don't get the bookings they're entitled to. They don't get the short money they would have been entitled to, and that's really important for the SNP, because there's, I mean, people down south might not know this, but basically the SNP is in a serious financial crisis at the moment. All the donor money has shriveled up ever since the Peter Murrell and Nicola Sturgeon scandal. But also because it's just become clear that independence is not happening. And then if you're going to look at the SNP governance record, there's not really a lot for to entice people.
No.
So there's just been a collapse. So they had to run this entire campaign actually using British Parliament short money. So I mean, they were even embarrassingly SNP MPs had to organize crowdfunders to try and fund their personal campaigns. So it's all been quite humiliating. And this is a sort of the more boring side of politics, but it's actually quite important. And so they're in a real pickle. How are they going to? There's a real risk that this is terminal decline. So they lose the coverage, they lose the money. That means they lose researchers. It means they lose full-time campaigners. Obviously, it shouldn't overextend it. I mean, they still have, of course, Holyrood, and where they're still the governing party as a minority. So they're not out, but they're pretty down. And I don't know where the sort of way forward it is for them, because I mean, the other issue is, to be honest, having a Labour government also significantly reduces the appeal of independence for a lot of voters in Scotland. The sort of the 2014 independence referendum, a huge part of the yes vote was sort of the part of that, the general anti-austerity, anti-conservative feeling that there was in Britain in the early 10s. But also, I mean, the anti-austerity stuff was across Europe with like Syriza and groups like that. That's all sort of ancient history, and if you've got a Labour government, that's just not there as an animus. So I think that then the SNP will struggle to appeal, certainly for the next 4 years. Of course, and then there is the issue, I think, after 26, when they're likely to lose their Holyrood majority. I think that is when Swinney will step down. And then it's likely it will be Kate Forbes as leader. But that can go two ways for them, because she's way out of kilter with the SNP organization. She's very, ironically, she's a bit of a sort of Ken Clarke figure in that she's very popular with people who are never going to vote SNP. Because of her strong sort of, well, actually, she's just very conservative. I think her husband actually is a confirmed conservative voter.
Oh,
so it's quite an interesting dynamic. I mean, it's not quite as incestuous as Jenny Gilruth, who is an SNP minister, whose wife is the former leader of the Scottish Labour Party. But anyway, but Forbes is basically a Tory on everything except the independence issue, and actually quite a conservative Tory. She's opposed to gay marriage, opposed to sex ed, abortion, this sort of stuff. She's pretty staunch actually, and as well as being also very much a business conservative, taxes and business, so so that she is just way off kilter with what the SNP membership want. So I'm not so sure she will be the likely leader, or if she would the SNP be able to function cohesively? So that leaves the question of who would actually lead them, and there's not an obvious successor.
No.
So it's looking. As a unionist, I'm very happy with the prospects of the SNP for the sort of short to medium term. Long term, who knows? But I think with the independence issue fundamentally taken off the table, I think it's going to be very tough for them to garner the kind of support they had 10 years ago.
Yeah. And of course, they've got Alex Salmond and Alba sort of flanking them on the independence issue. And as much as there might be controversy around some of Alex Salmond's activities, he is an excellent political campaigner. And when you got him there, I think if they did put Kate Forbes in, she might be able to do it. But as you say, she's so out of kilter. I mean, she's that sort of the old stereotype of the SNP before the 1970s of being the Tartan Tories.
Yes, yeah.
And so I think we'll have to really wait for after 2026 to see what the sort of fate of the SNP will really be, as you said, with the Holyrood results.
Yes, I mean, the more optimistic case for Forbes-led SNP is actually they would go the way of the Bloc Québécois in Canada and end up sort of transitioning less from a openly secessionist movement to a sort of more of a sort of Scottish sort of lobby group, basically. Similar to the sort of the Irish Parliamentary Party in the 19th century.
Yeah.
Which of course didn't end well for the Irish Parliamentary Party, but but there's just such a different context here. Obviously, there hasn't been a disastrous famine that's permanently poisoned the relationship between most Scots and the British government, and there isn't this. There is a lot of religious sectarianism in Scotland, but it is overwhelmingly Protestant, so there's not really much likelihood that would fuel anything. And also, there's just not the history of violent sort of separatist activity that there was in Ireland. So it's a bit like, I don't know if you saw this. This was a couple of years ago, and it was in the American context. Obviously, when there was a lot of sort of Civil War talk on sort of Twitter and places, and basically someone made a joke that there's not going to be a civil war, guys. Everyone's fat, and I think that's very applicable to a lot of stuff in sort of Western politics. A lot of people sort of LARP as like there's the oncoming collapse and how they're going to or there's going to be a revolution or a civil war or a war of independence, and there just isn't, because actually life is pretty good. Despite the very shrill state of online and media sort of coverage of politics, life is actually quite good. For people are fed, they're warm, So I just don't think there is the groundswell for a nationalist, a permanent nationalist movement. I may be too optimistic, but that's the way it's looking at the moment up here, I think.
Yeah. I mean, since you mentioned Ireland, we might as well go to look at Northern Ireland.
Yes, yeah.
I'll just get just go down. Right, so just go down to these results here. So, see if we can zoom in. Here in Northern Ireland, we've got
Scotland.
There we go.
There we go.
So, as you can see, we've got the ones in these here are all Sinn Féin seats. As I say, Sinn Féin is it's the political wing of what of the Provisional IRA, which, despite what people seem to claim, still does exist and still has norms. And the dark green here are the SDLP. They are the constitutional nationalists. In many ways, they are the sort of successors to the Irish Parliamentary Party, and the fact that they oppose violence. And also the continuation of the Irish Parliamentary Party, the Nationalist Party, which existed in Northern Ireland from effectively partition up until the late 60s. They sort of come out of that tradition. And then those the ones here in the sort of light sort of dark pink are the DUP, the Democratic Unionists. They are a breakaway from the UUP. They're a very hardline Protestant unionist party, and they are now the largest unionist party in Northern Ireland. And here we have, this is a Jim Alister's seat, the traditional unionist voice, who are themselves a breakaway from the DUP. They are more sort of, they're very much against the border, the sea border, as well as elements of the peace process. And then finally, we have the Ulster Unionist Party, who are the oldest unionist party, as I mentioned before, in Northern Ireland. And they were the ones who the DUP broke away from in the late 60s. And then we have here the Alliance Party, who are, as I say, they're meant to be cross-community, but they have been for the past couple of years leaning towards the sort of nationalist side. And then the one final one here we have is the Independent. Now, this is Alex Easton, who was a member of the DUP. He left them. And it's interesting, that was where Tim Collins, who had been a colonel in the British Army, he was standing for the Ulster Unionists. It looked like he could have won, but during the general election, the TUV and Reform created an alliance to back Alex Easton, and so that's how Alex Easton won. And you could argue that he, like Jim Alister, is sort of Reform adjacent in a way, because Reform are doing something which I think more British, particularly the Tory party, should do, which is integrate Northern Ireland into sort of mainstream British politics, because for a century or more, the Unionists of Northern Ireland have been, to my mind, disgracefully treated like sort of the red-headed stepchildren of the UK, where nobody wants to go near them, but they should be, to my mind, integrated into sort of mainstream British politics, which Alex Easton's selection and Jim Alister's election sort of hopefully will sort of herald that.
Yeah, I'd actually totally agree on that point about integrating, because to be honest, basically the sort of consensus view of British sort of politics is they're just very annoyed that they have to deal with Northern Ireland. I mean, I think there was even talk of handing them over in World War II, wasn't there? Just to, I don't know how serious it was, but it does confirm the general sort of attitude of the British sort of political class, which is to, so yeah, the tradition of the British political class selling out their most loyal subjects is a well established tradition at this point. But yeah, I think that, it would be quite interesting, and I wonder how it would work, because I suppose the UUP used to be aligned with the Conservative Party.
Yeah,
I'm not sure. Was that in the 60s? Was that when they split?
They split over the first. For those who don't know, Northern Ireland, when partition took place, Home Rule was imposed on Northern Ireland through an elected Parliament storm. That continued up until 1972, when it was closed down, and that's what caused the Ulster Unionists to split off from the Tories.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, that was quite an interesting one as well. I don't know enough about the period, because the whole issue of the Irish War of Independence was, and the whole issue of Home Rule not working was because the Ulster Unionists had rejected Home Rule for Northern Ireland, and then it was home rule was given to the southern part, which then became the republic.
Mm.
But then home rule was imposed on the northern part. So I don't know. You probably know a lot more about that. Why that happened?
As far as it was just it was an attempt because the Liberals had obviously before World War One been trying to get Northern Ireland, what will become Northern Ireland, to accept home rule. They weren't, and to the extent that if World War One had broken out, you could have had a civil war in Ireland between
Yes.
the Unionists who were arming themselves, the what were called the Ulster Volunteers, which became then the Ulster Volunteer Force, the first UVF, which is
Hmm.
separate from the paramilitary during the Troubles.
Hmm.
Whilst down south you had the Irish Volunteers and the Irish Citizen Army who were doing the same thing, and there was gun running. You had what was called the Curragh mutiny, where this was in the spring of 1914. There was a miscommunication from the War Office of regiments stationed at Curragh, which is just outside Dublin, that they were going to be sent to enforce home rule in what was then Ulster. And the officers who received this offered their resignation, their commission, to resign the commissions, so they didn't have to carry out the order. And I saw it called this so-called mutiny because they offered up to resign their commissions. They weren't going to mutiny because they weren't refusing the order. So that was all going on. And then after the war, you obviously had the Irish War of Independence and then partition. And I think from everything I read, it seemed like the imposition of home rule on Northern Ireland was an attempt sort of to leave it open to the idea of Irish unification, from what I can tell. But that itself, just to go on a slight tangent about Northern Ireland, that period, all the sort of sectarian trouble in terms of discrimination stemmed from the imposition of home rule. If it had been just integrated into the rest of the UK, most of the sort of the civil rights difficulties you got in the 60s in Northern Ireland would not have occurred.
Yeah.
Because it just would have been the one of the issues about the imposition of home rule was that when an Northern Irish MP like Jerry Fitt, who was a member of the SDLP, an interesting character in and of himself, but he would try and raise questions in the 60s about issues in Northern Ireland, and the Speaker of the House of Commons at the time would simply say, "This is a matter for the Parliament of Northern Ireland," and wouldn't let things go any further. And so that was the British government just shunted things off in terms of Northern Ireland and let Stormont rule it. And that sort of build up trouble. I should say that the discrimination in Northern Ireland and the other issues have been exaggerated to a degree, but it was there.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Because I'd have thought the obvious point would have been to, as you say, to have just kept direct rule for Northern Ireland all through the period, and obviously home rule for the south. But and then obviously there was a period of direct rule from, was it 72 to 97? Was it, or basically, but once the Troubles had kicked off, and then all the way through to the Good Friday Agreement. But I'm not sure why Stormont was reintroduced, given what a sort of mess it was before, and to be honest, what a mess it's been since. I mean, there haven't been the civil rights abuses, but it has been basically ungovernable.
Yeah.
And we've had sort of periodically, effectively, direct rule has had to be reintroduced a couple of times in the last decade, just because the two factions can't agree on a governing coalition.
Yeah. I mean, oh, sorry.
No, go on.
I think that simply it's a matter of, again, it's that treatment of wanting to get rid of Northern Ireland, and there's the idea that you can sort of that they're bringing the allowing the Republic of Ireland to have a say within Northern Ireland, sort of thing. It's that. I should say, I think I certainly am opposed to devolution across the board, and I think from I'm not sure what your views are on that.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm absolutely, I can't stand it. I can't stand devolution. I think, I mean, at the moment, I think it's too sensitive to really row back on. I mean, So my feelings on terms of English devolution is I think that could be swept away with one piece of legislation because there's no real love for any of the sort of city mayors or London Assembly or anything. That could be done, but in terms, possibly Wales because there's a lot of dissatisfaction and it wasn't that popular, the introduction of a Welsh Assembly. Scotland. Actually, it would be too dangerous now. Although the number of people, according to polls, who now say they are opposed to devolution is at an all-time high. I think it was about 20-something% a few months ago, up from like 10 years ago. So I'm sort of my position on there is we sort of just allow it to keep becoming more and more dysfunctional until there is a popular mandate to actually get rid of it. Northern Ireland now it's also a tricky one because there is just this history of violence. It's so I think it's a sort of salutary neglect might just be the best way forward now for the foreseeable future. I would like to get rid of the whole thing. I wish it had never been done. I think. I mean, in terms of home rule for the south of Ireland, my position is more that I don't think they should have been integrated in the UK at all. In 1801, I think that was a huge mistake. I think we'd have been much better off if we'd allowed them to progress, as I think they would have done, into being a sort of large Isle of Man. Shared monarchs, shared sort of armed forces, etc., but sort of effectively self-governing. Because I think there was a loss of sort of the big picture. In terms of British sort of governing thought at that time, the big picture is we want sort of from an English and British perspective, you want Ireland to be kept in a friendly sort of symbiotic relationship, so it isn't a launch pad for French or German or Spanish invasions of Britain, or even today, even Russian, or so. You want to have an amicable, and you want it sort of in the tent, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a sort of county of Britain, which is, I think, the sort of more hardline unionism of the 19th century got sort of obsessed with on a sort of ideological point, with all the sort of unhappiness that followed from that. But as it stands now, I think, salutary neglect is probably the best way forward. It could well be that we could, power sharing could collapse again, and we just don't sort of pursue power sharing. We just say, look, that's this has happened, and we just. I mean, you could still involve the Irish government. I think you could have sort of the Irish government as sort of as a represented. You have like a permanent representation to the Northern Ireland office. I don't know. You could have some way of sort of honouring the terms of the Good Friday Agreement without continuing with the sort of shambolic institution that is Stormont. But anyway, but as I said, it's a very sensitive topic, and I'm in no position to do any of this. But yes, but anyway, sorry, I've rambled. But to your point, I'm not a fan of devolution. I think it's partly on principle, but also pragmatically. I think it's had very poor outcomes for all the Celtic countries, and also it's fundamentally failed at its main object, which is to kill nationalist sentiment. Which in fact in all cases it's served to entrench separatist parties and to give them platforms and resources they wouldn't otherwise have had. So that's yes. So not a fan.
No, I mean I'm opposed to devolution across the board. I think that the reason why you had another reason for the imposition of sort of devolution in Northern Ireland was because of that sort of new Labour sort of support for devolution across the board.
Yes,
in Scotland and Wales, so they did Northern Ireland, but with the nationalists and the union, with the nationalists and the Republicans in Northern Ireland, there was an interesting thing with the during the general election where Sinn Féin and the SDLP did a sort of electoral pact, and during that, Sinn Féin supporters were absolutely vile towards the SDLP, and I remember during the sort of days after the general election, the SDLP was coming out and criticising Sinn Féin, and there's a account on Twitter called, I've forgotten his name now, Sage Opinions. I'm not sure if you follow his account.
No, I've not heard of him.
He's an academic. He's written a number of books. I've forgotten his name now. Liam something or other. He's at Queen's University, and he sort of pointed out to them, well, you know what they're like. A generation ago, people like John Hume and Jerry Fitz would have told you what they were like, and of course they're going to do that. And I did point out to them, the way that Sinn Féin came to dominance as a major party in Ireland was at the expense of the Irish Parliamentary Party. What makes you think that they're not going to do everything in their power to do the same to you again?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, yeah, there is a general problem that the sort of British politicians don't seem to know even the histories of their own parties anymore. Across the board. I don't know why that's happened, but it's led to all sorts of very, very poor decision making, which is sort of But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I don't know. I suppose the unionist parties would be, obviously they'd be more inclined, closer alignment with Great Britain. But would the nationalist parties, I'm sure they would have a big fuss over, any moves in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think they kick up. Yeah, they would. Sinn Féin would just do what Sinn Féin always does. The SDLP wouldn't like it, but at the Unionists, I think they could be convinced. Especially, I know that in Reform, Farage has actually quite close links with the DUP, and obviously, you disappeared. Oh, Stephen seems to have gone. Hello. I'll just see if I can get him back. See if he's gone. Stephen seems to have gone. I'll just wait for him to message me. But I'll just continue with the point I'm making. Northern Ireland, Reform Farage has close links with the DUP, from what I can tell, and Reform has established links with the TUV. And Ben Habib, who was their deputy leader, was very close to Jim Allister. So you could see a sort of broad, sort of pan-unionist coalition at some point, possibly, but that would depend on. Oh, here we go.
Hello.
Hi,
sorry. My internet just cut suddenly. I've missed the last couple of minutes of what you were saying. Sorry.
I was just saying that Farage has, from what I can tell, good links with the DUP, and Reform have obviously got their electoral pact with the TUV, and I could imagine, especially if Farage, particularly Ben Habib, who was until recently Reform's deputy leader, he had not just good links with the TUV, but with people in the DUP, and I think he had reached out to the Ulster Unionists, so you could see a pan-unionist alliance in Northern Ireland at some point in the future, but that might take a few years.
Yeah, I mean, that would be. That does seem to be the sort of obvious position for unionists to go on in terms of, maximizing their vote in terms of seats and in Stormont. I mean, it's a very frustrating point up in Scotland where, for example, it's really stark with the Scottish Liberal Democrats and the Scottish Conservatives, where they're often not only are they both unionists, but they're actually competing for the same type of unionist
Yeah.
in terms of sort of middle class and rural based unionists, and all they do is end up taking votes off each other and splitting the vote, and at both Holyrood and Westminster, which is quite frustrating from a unionist perspective. But they so no, that'll be very interesting in Northern Ireland. I suppose if you had a sort of unionist, I suppose you couldn't call it unionist alliance because that would be too confusing. Given the alliance, but sort of a unionist, I don't know, league or covenant or something. That would be quite interesting. Cool. Well, yeah, I suppose then we head to the Tories, should it be, or should we go to Wales first?
We might as well go to Wales since they've had some. In the past sort of day or two, they've had some real interesting difficulties.
Yes.
For those who don't know, in Wales, they obviously had the Welsh Assembly, which is the Senedd, and it's been run by the Labour Party either as a let's just see if there's a Cardiff seat, either as a Labour has been in power since it was established, and they've either done it as a Labour government or in a coalition with Pride for about 4 years, from 2005 to 2009, I think it was. But recently, their current First Minister, when he was elected as Labour leader in Wales in March, had some there's an over sort of donation from a businessman, which has some controversial elements about it, and that sort of dogged him. And finally, it was, I think, Thursday night he had some ministers resign, and then it would have been a few days ago. He had some ministers resign, and then the day after he resigned, and so they're currently getting a new leader at the moment.
Yes, that's right. I mean, Gethings lasted for what, 4 months in the end?
Yeah.
So it wasn't. His resignation speech was particularly undignified. Were basically, not what we're used to in Britain, really. Basically, talking about how he's been forced out and all the rest of it, and how he had been, done all he could to, be sort of conciliatory, and basically a spiteful world had rejected him. But that's a whole palaver there. I mean, I've not much sympathy for Welsh Labour in terms of, they've been very happy to court, the separatists in Plaid for short-term advantage, which is exactly the same sort of, tactical silliness that Scottish Labour did, and as you were just saying, the SDLP have done in Northern Ireland. So, as I said, it all comes to none of them seem to read any political history at all. But but in terms of what'll happen, I suppose it's not too substantive, really. I mean, Wales is just this sort of, for now, this Labour fiefdom. They sort of run it however they feel like. If they want to put a 20-mile speed limit, they put a 20-mile speed limit. If they decide to reverse that, they reverse that. And there's no real opposition to them. And of course, after this election, there's not a single Conservative seat in the whole of Wales. Lost every single one. So I'm sure Wales will just keep ticking along. I mean, on the devolution thing, as I said, I just think it's ridiculous. I mean, obviously, like, Wales and England have been legally incorporated since about 1500. So for 500 years. It's not like Scotland, which has had a separate church and a separate legal system and a separate education system, etc., from all through the Union. Whereas Wales has just been part of England, hence why it's not included on the Union Jack. So this sort of deliberate carving out, again, as you said, is just It's the New Labour basically sort of. I think this is me speculating, but I think it was largely in order to prevent, what after the experience of 18 years of conservative domination of the UK via England, basically to ensure that even if you had a conservative government, whole chunks of the country would remain under the total control of the Labour Party, or at least of progressive parties, which is basically what we've had over the last 14 years, which is again added to the sort of, frankly, the uselessness of the Conservative Party, which is it's just not in control of large parts of the country. Which in our system, of course, we're not a federal constitution, so it just leads to all sorts of misgovernance and lack of scrutiny, and and irresponsibility, because there's just whole sections where we're not sure whether it comes under which quango or council or parliament or. So of course nobody does it. So no, I if I could, if I was sort of Napoleon, I would very much abolish all the sort of Welsh devolved institutions. Anyway, so I suppose that brings us to England, and I suppose the big story then, if we've done Labour, is the collapse of the Conservatives to 120. That's not too. It's worse than the exit poll, but it's not too dissimilar, because I think the exit poll had them about 129. They got 121, so they're basically in the same boat that they looked like they were going to be in. Obviously, that's a lot better than some of the seat projections we had through the election.
Yeah, definitely.
Some of them had them, potentially falling behind the Liberal Democrats. But it's it's pretty terrible, but it's not unsalvageable. I think, again, of course, it's all going to depend now on the leadership election, what way they go. But I think it's unlikely that. I was always skeptical of sort of 0 seats. Which people and I think that's really been put to bed by this. I think there's just not any way for reform to overtake them at this point, unless the Tories really decide to sort of self-immolate like the Liberals did in the 20s. And, split into 2 different factions, and then maybe. But I think at the moment they seem pretty united. There is talk that Braverman might be going to switch to Reform. But I just, she could do, but I think that would be so wrong-headed, because she would go from being, the main sort of voice of the right in the opposition party to just another sort of member of the Farage band. So I doubt she's going to do that. I think the only way you might get serious splits is if, by some fluke, Victoria Atkins ended up, leader of the Tory party, which I just think is not going to happen. That's I don't know. So we are gearing up for the leadership election. I think obviously there's the main contenders who've been mentioned are Braverman. Well, I'll do from sort of. Yeah, it's not as simple as this, but roughly on sort of vibes from rightmost to leftmost, the likely candidates are Braverman, Jenrick, Badenoch. Oh, sorry, Braverman, Patel, Jenrick, Badenoch. Probably, I don't know if Cleverly will stand in the end, but he might, and then Tugendhat and Atkins. I'd say, because Hunt's ruled himself out. And I think I think it will then. I think Braverman and Atkins will get knocked out pretty quickly at the parliamentary stage. I think it will be one of the 3 of Tugendhat, Badenoch, and Jenrick. I think there is. Not, this may be too optimistic, but actually, I think there's a decent chance that the final 2 are Jenrick and Badenoch. Which I think, which for if like me, you're on sort of the broadly on the right of the party, I think that's very positive. That would be the first time we'd managed to get both candidates through to the membership who are from the right of the party, and that would speak to the sort of. I think it would be really the nail in that this is the end of sort of Cameron era, soft C conservatism. That it's really run its course, and I think this result really cemented that. That they're. I know, in a way, I was quite happy that I know there was talk of sort of removing Sunak for someone else, but actually, I was quite happy they didn't do that because basically, whatever faction, from the Trust budget, we'd lost the election. And I think, obviously, then what happens is a question of narrative. And if you're the faction in charge when you lose the election, you are discredited. So now it is the Tory establishment who are completely discredited. Because it was their project. They called the shots for the last 2 years. And they've led it to, as you said, the worst defeat since 1832. So I think they've tried to sort of weasel their way out of that, but I think it's fallen away pretty quickly. Trying to say all their excuses about we must be responsible and not populist and all this sort of stuff. I think that lasted about 2 days after the election because I think the result was so clearly refuted their whole position, because especially the point that I think it's true that we can't win without getting back some centrist voters, because even if you put in all the voters that Reform all the seat, if you added the Tory and Reform vote shares together and you look at the seat distributions, you move into hung parliament territory rather than a majority territory. So it's essential, but not enough to reunite the right. I would say probably Badenoch and Jenrick, as it stands at the moment, are the two most likely to do that. If they pick Tugendhat, then I think they may well have doomed themselves. And I actually do like him. I know a lot of people on the right absolutely hate him. I think he seems like a nice enough guy. I think he's just mostly like a lot of the sort of ex-officers, army officers. He's sort of predominantly interested in foreign affairs and doesn't really think much at all about home affairs or economic affairs. So they then tend to just go with the flow, and the flow at the moment is the sort of progressive consensus, which is why they get seen as being on the left of the party. But I just don't think they think very deeply about this stuff at all. But anyway, that's where he is. I think he's fine. I'm sure in a future cabinet, I think he'd be perfectly fine as, a foreign secretary or defense secretary or something. But yeah, I think they'd be very, very silly if they make him leader, and I just don't think they will. Because I just don't think the members will wear it unless he runs a truly spectacular campaign, akin to which can happen. I mean, that is what Cameron did over Davis in 2005, or rather, that Davis ran a particularly abortive campaign. What was it? It's time for double D or whatever it was. That was the slogan. So it will be quite interesting. The other debate is how long the campaign is going to be. Of course, there was talk of in 2005 they had a 7-month campaign. I think that would just be extremely self-indulgent if they did that. I think it's more likely it'll be sort of October at the latest, before conference, which is more than enough time to. I think you could. I don't think it should be more than 6 weeks.
No.
But in all likelihood, it'll probably be 2 months. But I think, I would say I think Cleverly will get, if he does stand, would get eliminated pretty quickly. I think, again, he's a nice guy, but there's sort of nothing to him. He doesn't really represent any faction. There's no sort of positive vision. It's just sort of, he's very much a vibes candidate. He's a nice guy and he likes his Warhammer. which is always a plus. But this is nothing. Yeah, I don't know what a cleverly government would be likely to bring me, or even a cleverly opposition. So I don't think any MPs are going to go for him.
No.
I think it would be. I mean, the one interesting thing about Tugendhat's campaign is he's winning. In a way, so far his declared supporters show that we really are moving beyond Brexit now. Because the first two people to come and endorse him have been two who are no longer MPs, but they're both from two opposite ends of the Brexit dispute, which are Damien Green, who was a very strong Remainer, and Stephen Baker, of course, who was the former head of the European Research Group, so the sort of captain of the Brexit contingent, of the Eurosceptic contingent of the party, and they've both endorsed Tugendhat, which is quite interesting. So yeah, I think it's quite up in the air. I think with Braverman, I think a lot of people who were leaning towards her are really plumping for Jenrick now. I think Danny Kruger apparently was going to be Braverman's number 2. He's joined Jenrick's camp. Whereas interestingly, Badenoch is sort of started off as the sort of appealing to people on the right, especially over stuff like gender, and then the sort of trans issue. But actually, she's very good friends with Gove, and so she's actually starting to make a lot of inroads with the more sort of middle of the road people in the party.
Yeah.
So you could end up with quite interesting. Whereas Jenrick, interestingly, started off as very much a Cameronite. I think he was even nicknamed something like Robert Generic or Generic. Just on the basis that he was just so bland and bog standard Cameron era Tory MP. But he's had a bit of a sort of Damascene conversion. I think there's a quite. I think what was it? I think he was sent to be immigration minister under Braverman by Sunak, basically to spy on her. That was the intention. Unfortunately, he then went native completely after actually reading the figures and coming into terms with it, and then has become a big immigration hawk. But then and actually, it looks like what little he was able to get through, despite the opposition from Hunt and Sunak, may well already have had a positive effect. I think his 5-point plan, they think, has reduced visa applications by 50%. So that will be something. Of course, Starmer will be able to take the credit for that, but within the Tory party, I think Jenrick would be able to make a lot of hay about that. That he's someone who, he's sort of the opposite of Braverman in that she's all sort of bombastic rhetoric and not at all that much achievement. Whereas his pitch would be, I'm sort of, yes, I come across as a nice bland sort of Tory MP, but actually I can actually get stuff done, which I think there's a big market for that, especially after the last 4 years. So it's all one-to-one. My only issue with all of them is none of them are particularly charismatic, to be honest. Not that would matter hugely against Keir Starmer, who again is not who's not exactly Julius Caesar, but still it would be nice to have sort of people could get excited about. I don't think there's anyone like that at the moment, but
no.
That's why I am sympathetic to a long-ish campaign to give them more time to actually see what they're like. I think we really don't want a repeat of the previous leadership election or indeed the 2017 one where it was a coronation for May.
Yeah.
So I think we want to actually see what they're made of. And you want, before it goes to the membership, you want the MPs to not just rally around their two preferred candidates, but just because of their sort of relative position within the cabinet, as happened last time, with Truss and Sunak, and then force the members to pick between two terrible choices. And then that's all. That's the big thing up in the air. I don't know what.
I'm gonna say, if it was looking at the ones, looking who looks like they're standing, for me it would be Badenoch more than Braverman. I like Braverman, but Badenoch just seems to have it more, something more about her.
Yeah,
more. It seems more acceptability than, as it were, than Braverman. Braverman is what she says I like, but she's very much on the maverick side, as it were. Whereas Badenoch could say the same thing, and it wouldn't come over as supposedly controversial.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot. We do need someone who can do that in the current environment, current media sort of landscape. Make who can make actually sort of do tough positioning, but not make it look as tough as it is. Which is whereas Braverman sort of does the opposite. Well, Patel is the worst for that.
Yeah,
She's actually the worst in terms of really almost cruel rhetoric, and then absolutely abysmal governance. This is why I think she'll get nipped in the bud pretty quickly as well, because it's sort of been a little bit forgotten about, but I don't think it'll be forgotten about in a leadership election. Is that she's actually the one responsible for the 1 million visas a year policy.
Yeah.
It's just she's the one who made it all about the boats crossing, the channel sort of crossings, and then sort of ripped open the floodgates. So ripped open the gates with regards to legal immigration, which has been what's led to the reform surge.
Yeah.
So she is very much one of the culprits of this disaster. And I'm sure the other leadership contenders will make that, clear quickly. Yeah. So I think she'll get eliminated fairly fast. So what would be more interesting is who they all endorse as they're knocked out. I would guess that Atkins and Cleverly will back Tujahad.
Yeah.
Which is why I think he will definitely get to the final 3. I would suspect although Cleverly could back Badenoch, because he was he's more in the middle of the party than the left of the party.
Yeah.
I would say I think it'd be quite interesting who Patel backs. I think it'd be quite interesting who Braverman backed if she got knocked out. I would, because she's probably because she's threatened by him. She's made a few anti-generic comments over the past couple of weeks. But I wonder how sort of deeply held that is. So that's the confusion. Sorry, not the confusion, but that's the question. We'll be interesting to see. I mean, the other thing, of course, is over the last, of course, Sunak is staying on as interim opposition leader, which I really don't think is a good decision. I think he should have just gone. I think would have been much better off if someone like Ian Duncan Smith had taken it for the next 2 months. Of course, his re-election was a bit of a surprise.
Yeah.
After again because of a Labour candidate being kicked out and then continuing to stand and splitting the Labour vote, and that's led to Ian Duncan Smith squeezing through.
Do you know why she got sacked?
She got sacked. It was something over Gaza, I think. It was Faiza Shaheen, wasn't it?
Yeah. Oh no, it's brilliant. It's because there's a French sort of political pollster called Philippe Lemoyne, and he quote tweeted one of her Gaza tweets that then got sent to the Labour Party. His quote tweet got sent to the Labour Party, and that's what got her sacked.
Oh, really?
He sort of jokingly said, put up this sort of Chad versus Virgin meme of sort of Virgin something or other, and him as Chad saving Britain 1 seat at a time from socialism. He just couldn't believe he couldn't believe that he'd done that.
God, that's amazing. No, I didn't know that. I knew it was something to do with God. I didn't realize it was Philippe Lemoyne who'd taken her out. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, just to go on the you mentioned before about the Tories splitting. I think you're right. They won't split, particularly because they can't not have noticed what happened to the Republicans in France.
Yeah,
where the leader there during their recent parliamentary elections endorsed National Rally, which is Le Pen's party, at which point they effectively locked him out the headquarters building and kicked him out as party leader. So I think that they will have looked at that and thought, no, we're not going to split. Whatever deal they do with reform, it will be something that will be acceptable to sort of the Tory party as a whole, as opposed to the right going off.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I wonder even if they will actually do a formal deal with reform at all. I think if they're able to make a convincing enough pitch on immigration and crime, then I think they will actually claw back enough of their old voters to not need to be in the running. And I think also, to be quite frank, 4 years of Labour, that will, take its toll on a lot of the people who sat out this time. People will be more keen for them to be kicked out. So a lot of those voters will drift back to the Conservative Party. So yeah, I think it's, well, again, this may be too optimistic of me. I think, voting reform has served its course. The point was to make it absolutely clear that, people are not happy with the sort of Cameronite drift of the party. They're not happy with being continually betrayed on key issues for social conservatives, and they expect action. I think they've done that, pretty spectacularly.
Yeah,
and I think the message has gone home for a lot of Tory MPs, which is positive. Although we will see if it has, but I think it does feel like the message has got through. So yeah, but yeah, I agree. I just don't think a split is likely. They might get the odd defector, but I think that was much more of a, that was much more of a feature of the last year, basically. Like if Farage couldn't even get Andrea Jenkins to switch, I think most of them just won't.
No.
Yeah.
Yes. I think that now that you've seen the left of the party take a hammering, the right don't have a reason to defect. They now can see an opportunity, and the real possibility of it is that they can take back control of the party, and so defecting would just be like shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there is a point that, in terms of the actual, composition of the party, I think it does actually lean slightly more to the left than it did before the election. Just because they tended to have been given the much safer seats by CCHQ, but not by that much. I think there was someone did do an analysis of I think it might have been Fred Frossard, but I can't remember. But yeah, but it's not as dramatic as people before the election were saying it would be. So there is still quite a strong contingent from the right, but the bigger contingent are basically the pure or almost apolitical. That they're mostly just concerned about their own career advancement.
Yeah.
So they will plump for who looks like he's going to make it more likely they're back in power. And if it looks like that has to be done from the right, they will tack to a right-wing candidate, like they did for Boris in 2019, like they did for Thatcher, of course.
Yeah.
Back in the day. So I think that's probably how it will go down. The unknown factor is a lot of these people are just untested publicly. I don't think any of them have really done proper debates and interviews before. So that it will be interesting to see actually how do they perform once the campaign actually kicks off. Because, like, for example, like you can often expose things you don't realize. Like, I mean, I know like Rory Stewart was sort of came across extremely weird in a couple of the debates, which most people wouldn't have known how weird he was. They just they looked at his record, they looked at a few statements he'd made. he looked like an interesting guy. Then once you actually see him in the debating chamber, he's something quite different. Yeah, so that will be quite interesting to see. There was talk of, would somebody, from the new intake stand, like Ruth Davidson had only been an MSP for 1 year when she stood for leader. But I think that was the Scottish MSPs. There were just not that many Tories at that time. And B, she was quite unusually, she was very much a sort of big fish in a small pond.
Yeah.
I think with 120 MPs, and it's a much bigger pond, I think you need to have been there for a few years to have built up the relations you need for a go at the Crown. So it will be those people we've discussed. There was talk that I had heard that Patel wasn't going to, because the internal polling about her among the members was so dire, but it looks like she's still persevering. So maybe that's all wrong. We'll find out next week. I think there's a possibility Cleverly just doesn't stand either, just because I think he's. To be honest, I just don't think he's up to it. I think he knows it on some level. I wouldn't be surprised if he knows it on some level, because he doesn't have the killer instinct, and as I said, he doesn't seem to believe in anything. There's no Cleverly project that he wants to get done. So again, I wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't stand. I mean, Atkins, I don't know why she's putting herself out there. I think in the betting she was like not even in the top 30 before the election. I don't think anyone was considering her at all. But for some reason she's got it into her head. Possibly just because if you stand for leader and you do okay, then there's more likelihood you're included in the shadow cabinet. I don't know if it's as simple as that. But I think, again, she could be pretty easily sort of politically assassinated based on her record as health secretary.
Yeah.
I mean, she is the one who changed the NHS ranking of medical students, of medical graduates, so that it's no longer based on ability. It's now randomized on the basis that too many minority groups were not scoring well enough. So now you can't actually see what people's grades were when you assign them to hospitals. This is something that would be like laughed at as like a loony left position in the 80s. And she, a Tory health minister, has put this through, and she said it in those terms, which was also quite remarkable. She believes in diversity and inclusion, etc., as just good things in and of themselves, and sort of competence of things are all secondary. So she's a true believer. Again, I don't actually know why she's in the Conservative Party, but she is. So it could be she's just trying to bolster up that faction of the party as well. Because I think even though Tugendhat is billed as the left-wing candidate, I don't think he's ever said anything particularly strong about any of those issues.
No.
Or, I just don't think he thinks about the sort of the culture war at all. So it'll be quite interesting. I suppose the final one is the Liberal Democrats, who of course have had a very good night, winning 70 seats.
Yeah, I do wonder how much that came down to the fact that Ed Davey, whilst in terms of some of the stuff he's done when he was in the coalition government, he himself comes as a personally quite interesting man. Both his personal background, because he was orphaned when he was extremely young, and he really has dragged himself up. And he does come across as the fact that he doesn't mind making a fool of himself every so often, as shown in the general election.
Yes, yeah.
Campaign. So I do wonder if the SNP owe some of their results down to him, but as a personal likability.
Yeah, I think that was a huge factor. I think also, I mean, you mentioned the coalition, but again, it shows you people do move on. I mean, it's now been 9 years since the coalition ended.
Yeah.
I think so. Again, like tuition fees and all that stuff, I just don't think it has the sting it had even 5 years ago. So yeah, I just think yeah, they've benefited from that, and then they've also just benefited from the Tory collapse because their actual number of votes, I think, even went down. The number of votes they actually won. So really, again, they've just benefited from the Tory collapse in the key. Also, to their credit, they ran a very good campaign. Ironically, as being the most prominent sort of advocate of electoral reform, they've actually become one of the most ruthlessly efficient at exploiting first past the post. I don't know if you saw this talk about the Gale strategy that they use. So for people who don't know, basically Gales is a sort of upmarket London bakery chain. I think it's now throughout the south of England. So the Liberal Democrats had a map of basically every constituency that has a Gales in it, and they just threw all their activists at those constituencies. So it was all about take off the sort of yummy mummies and Range Rover dads and peel them off the Tories in key areas, which they did very well. And if you do that properly in first past the post, you end up winning 72 seats on 9% of the vote. Or sorry, was it 10%? So they're fair enough to them. And there's actually a lot of room, I think, that the Tories should be looking to learn from that. Not that specific strategy, but this targeting key areas, throwing everything into where you're actually going to win, getting your vote to be efficiently distributed rather than piled up in certain areas. The other thing to learn from the Lib Dems is, which they did very well, is on the candidate selection. They selected their candidates, I think, 2 years before the general election. They had them all ready to go. And then their candidates have spent the last 2 years cultivating local links, really getting to know their area, really laying down the roots. It's really quite very good, very professional. And I think that's something the Tories should do. I think once we've got a new leader, once they've sort of reorganized the central office of the party, so from, let's say, middle of next year, I think they should already be hunting for candidates.
Yeah.
I think, sorry.
I was just going to mention on the candidates, I agree with you there. But I think when the general election was called, some of the constituencies didn't even have a candidate ready, and they had to rush it to get
the Tory ones.
Yeah.
No, it's all just. I mean, the problem of sort of, the James Forsyth strategy of the element of surprise. Was it's not great when you've surprised even your own association and even your own cabinet. So no, that just needs to be sorted. And I think that's a easy win the Tories could do structurally. It is get that from next year, start the hunt, and by the end of next year have them all ready to go. And then just spend the next 2 years or so just prepping. I mean, because that was actually what the Scottish Conservatives did, and that's why they outperformed the whole UK party. And they ended up winning 5 seats, which so basically they didn't lose any seats from last time, and that's pretty good given the rest of the party lost 2/3 of the seats. But they basically went for the Lib Dem strategy. That they had their targeted areas. They knew who was likely to lean towards them. They threw all their activists at those areas. They had their strong local candidates who really knew the area, like David Mundell, and they had a few key messages. Like the main one, I believe, was obviously there was the squeeze message, which is obviously the Tories are the best place to beat the SNP. And then up in the northeast, they could also go on. The Tories are the Scottish Tories, I should say, are the only pro North Sea oil party. Which they were able to exploit there. So that's I would think the UK party should learn from them, as well as the Liberal Democrats. And then don't want to be too optimistic, but there's the potential to win back well over 100 seats next general election.
Yeah.
It should, as we said, and that brings me to like the way Labour has gone about governing with the King's Speech. There was talk from sort of Labour friends, and then later on in the media about, oh no, Starmer, he understands the majority is very fragile.
Yeah.
He really, he knows he has to deliver. Their eyes are already on 2028, and then the King's Speech has come, and it's just completely like it's all the worst things they thought they would be doing.
Yeah.
The energy policy is just ridiculous. Um, I mean, obviously, I'm quite upset about them getting rid of the hereditary peers, but I know
Yeah.
most people aren't.
Yeah.
So that's not politically suicidal, but the energy policy is mad. The public sector pay policy is totally unsustainable. The OBR policy is so self-destructive because that is just going to tie their own hands behind their backs for the rest
Yeah.
of their government. Which I don't know when. Almost certainly at some point, I think they'll end up having to break their pledge not to raise income tax,
Oh yeah.
which will go down, swimmingly with voters, as it always does, as George H.W. Bush could tell them. You know, I'm sure the VAT raid on private schools, that is going to enrage people in places like Edinburgh or like the home counties.
Yeah.
Probably for like that could do permanent damage if you hit parents, aspirational parents in those areas. So I'm actually quite confident that, I mean, we'll see what the budget is in September, but I'm actually quite confident that they're going to make a dog's breakfast of this.
Oh
Yeah, and also the continuing with David Lammy as foreign secretary. I mean, for any of your viewers who haven't, I'm sure most of them have seen it, but they should go. And I think there's a video on YouTube which is called like David Lammy's best moments from Mastermind, which is where he went on and just stuff like not knowing, mixing up Marie Antoinette and Marie Curie and thinking that Henry VII was the son of Henry VIII, and this just extraordinary. He's, I'm afraid, not the brightest bulb in the in the lamp. So it's and so I'm actually confident that and then also, oh god, yeah, of course, on that their solution to the channel issue is just to fast track everyone's asylum
yeah.
asylum tickets, basically, which again is revealing because it shows they really genuinely think that the whole issue is over the process not being done, and not the actual fact of people don't want loads of 20-year-old Afghans in the middle of their town centres next to their where their little girls walk to school every morning. and they but so yeah, they generally don't see the issue. And then also that's definitely gonna also their planning reform is just a completely worthless. And basically their solution to the housing market is just going to build a load of new towns. Well, given that it takes about 10 years to get a planning project done in Britain at the moment, good luck having that all sorted by the next general election. So yeah, I'm pretty confident that it's going to be an absolute mess of a government. So the Tory, it really is in their ballpark. I think they can really turn this around. So I suppose the final one then is Reform. What do they do? I'll let you come on.
With Reform, they have 5 seats at the moment. Well, officially 5 seats, but you could argue they have 7 with the 2 in Northern Ireland. If they want to succeed, they really do need to make sure they get their local, they build up the local things at the local level, like UKIP did, because UKIP's success began with a basis at local government level, which they could do I'm sure there's people inside Reform doing this now, where they're looking at where they got the biggest votes in each constituency, and then looking at the wards in the local council, and if they do that, they can build up a big huge representation of local government, which of course then enables them at a general election to really target the particular constituencies. And I think the major ones they want to concentrate on will be up here in the north with Ashfield, which is where Lee Anderson is the member, who was a Tory but then defected to Reform in, I think it was about February, and it technically says here on the general election website it's a gain from Conservative, but you could argue it's actually just a hold for Reform.
Yeah,
because he was there before the general election. The other one is, of course, down here. Let's mention that. There we go. Clacton, which is the seat that Farage holds. If he and the local Reform Party can really dig into the sort of local government in Clacton, they can use that to sort of expand outwards and keep Clacton itself. Which I think really for Reform, it's concentrated at a local level and digging in the constituencies they currently got.
Yeah, I think that is just straightforward the way to go. I mean, you could see quite an interesting kind of parallel, in the same way that the Lib Dems built themselves by the methods you're talking about from the southwest outwards, with sort of Reform doing it from the northeast downwards, which would be quite interesting. Again, it comes to the point we discussed earlier about actually it's going ahead. It's probably Labour that's more vulnerable to losing seats to Reform. I mean, I don't think this will happen, but there is a lot of logic in some sort of electoral pact where, the Tories stand down in like these northern areas where they're just never going to win, and Reform ditto within the south. Then you could end up really maximalising the right's vote share in the elections to come. I just don't think they will do that just because they hate each other. Unfortunately, the leaderships of the two parties absolutely loathe each other.
Yeah.
As is often the case with these things, sort of the I don't know who called it the narcissism of petty difference. Tends to be the deciding factor. But but there is an interesting one. If they start taking off, if Reform ends up taking like 20 seats off Labour or 30 seats off Labour next time, and the Tories can end up taking off 100, I mean that's hung Parliament territory. Which will be very interesting. I think, and that's like my more pessimistic case. I think if the Tories really get their act together, there's the potential to flip the whole thing over again. Because I think we are in a very volatile period, similar to the sort of 60s and 70s. Or the 1920s, or the 1870s, where things are just constantly, you just get red blue when it comes to the elections. As until someone you actually elect somebody or a government that's actually serious about addressing the problems, which so far it looks like Starmer isn't. So it'll be very interesting. There is I think a lot of sort of politics people make a lot of the Farage. Sorry, will he enjoy doing? Will he take the time to do constituency work? The voters won't thank him if he neglects them. I just don't think they'd care if he did or didn't, because I think he has that star quality. That said, I don't see there's any reason why he wouldn't. I mean, it's really not that difficult. I mean, he already gets the funding. He will have a caseworker. He'll have the money to hire a caseworker. So for people who don't know, you do get automatically funded. As if you're elected, you get automatically money for a parliamentary assistant, a press officer, and a caseworker. And that covers the bases. And that's all you need, really.
I know. I think on Twitter you mentioned that you yourself have been involved in politics in the Tory party, if I'm right in saying.
Yes. Yeah.
The reason I just mentioned that is because I used to. My local MP is Mike Wood, and he's a Tory MP, and I used to volunteer in his office. So I'm not sure how many people know about the fact that when you go to an MP to ask for help, it's their caseworkers that will handle most of it. And so I think as long as Farage has got a reasonably good constituency caseworker team, that issue isn't going to be there.
Yeah, I think that's I think a lot of people don't realize that. And yeah, that if he I mean, there was of course Owen Paterson famously didn't attend his surgeries in his constituency for something like 11 years before he finally lost his seat, which shows you you've got to be pretty neglectful for it to be an issue, but also even then the voters will tolerate you for 11 years of not doing your job. So yeah, I just think it's just not going to be an issue. He'll be fine. He'll be an MP for ages, and more importantly, as we've mentioned, short money. That is going to be now. Reform will be able to fund, permanent researchers and campaign officers. This whole operation was very shoestring. They didn't have the infrastructure, they didn't have the research. They really were all just dependent on the air war, on Farage's abilities. Next time, and this is a concern for both Tory and Labour, if Reform do as you've said and build up their local associations, but also if they use their foot in the parliamentary system to get the sort of research on voters and policies and things, then they can start building a much more formidable operation. And that, and I think if they're serious about it, I think why wouldn't they? I don't think Farage just wants to sit there and do nothing for 5 years. I think it's in every bit his interests to build up another party that's significant. So yeah, it will be very interesting to watch. And I think he's in a position where, like, the one interesting thing is him sidelining Ben Habib, which I think is, I know the reason is, it's because he's not an MP, but I think it's more the issue that Farage is a bit of an egomaniac, and he tends to, he wants his parties to be the Farage show. He doesn't really like up and comers, and that is an issue. I think looking really further ahead with the reform, if Farage is this type of person who doesn't want future rivals to emerge, eventually he will have to go, and then if they've got nobody to succeed him, then they will just fizzle out. So that's on him, what direction he wants to take there. But yeah, I'd say that's it really.
One thing I would just like to discuss is the independence in here on the British mainland.
Yes.
Where we've had, I want to just get one in particular I want to look at, because it's to do with George Galloway's party, which is Workers UK, and they're very much based on foreign effect. They're a left-wing British, they're left-wing nationalist party, UK nationalist party, as it were, and it's to look at the independence, and because here we have the kind of, so Adnan Hussein, who very much ran on a protesting Labour's Gaza policy. He won here, as you can see, 27% of the vote. But then you have down here the Craig Murray, who's the Workers' Party of Britain, which is Galloway's party. He won 18.3%.
Yes.
I'm looking at that. If he hadn't stood, you could well have seen Adnan Hussein win over 40% of the vote, and almost all of that, as you can see from the Labour, the Labour loss minus 39.3%, could have come from Labour. There's a real problem Labour has at the moment with the Muslim vote in quite a number of constituencies where it can, as these independents have shown, really do damage to Labour. I mean, the big one that didn't happen, but came very close, was Wes Streeting's constituency, where he nearly lost because of a an independent standing, just like Adnan Hussein did here in Blackburn.
Yes. Yeah.
One thing I should just point out about Blackburn is that Blackburn was held from, I think, 1979 up until 2015 by Jack Straw, who was a big beast in New Labour. And so you are seeing there a real swing against Labour in a seat where not only was it held by a big beast, but it's another one of those northern seats where they don't count the Labour vote, it's weight.
Yeah. Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, I wonder, going ahead, will the Workers' Party, I mean, if the war in Gaza ends, as it eventually will it be as salient an issue going forward? However, the question is, do they change from just being about Gaza to being in general about, British Muslim issues?
Yeah.
Which I think there is an explicitly Muslim party in Holland.
Yeah.
So that would be quite interesting if that sort of institutionalizes. The other route that happens is what's happened to sort of the far left in France, sort of the NUPES, where basically they are the old communists, but they are basically their key voter bloc are Muslims, French Muslims. That could be the other one, which could end up be quite interesting if the Green Party ends up being turned from, the sort of sandal wearing sort of vegetarians that they are at the moment to actually sort of a quite menacing sort of British Islamist force. That would be quite interesting. And that would be quite, again, a weak point for the Labour Party.
Yeah.
Because they, at the moment, they own the sort of Muslim vote. If that starts fragmenting as well, there's the potential to lose, I think, about 20 seats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just wondering. I wonder if this election is for the British Muslim voters who just vote Labour, the way that UKIP was in 2010 and 2015 for working class Labour voters, where it's the first proper break where they can see they can vote for somebody else.
Yeah, no, that is an interesting point. I mean, I've heard a lot of analysis, not just on the Muslim issue, but in general, that there's the potential that this landslide looks very like the 1906 Liberal landslide.
Yeah.
And that in fact it's it could well be the sort of penultimate chapter of the Labour Party. I think that's possibly too hysterical at this point, but there are a lot of striking similarities, in that you've got a big majority, but actually quite antagonistic factions within it. If you sort of take the Muslim vote as sort of a stand-in for like the Irish home rulers, so that's an interesting one. I don't know if that could also be sort of a tactical misstep from the British Muslim population, because that could end up turning the British governing class against them in a much more decisive fashion, which it would actually, the community here is so recent, it would only require a few quite small policy changes to basically reduce their presence by about 80%. Stuff as simple as visa caps, but also like visa renewal caps as well, just not renewing visas, social housing reform. You would end up, you could actually seriously tackle the issue within, I think, less than 5 years. And the issue would just be solved. And I think that could potentially happen. I mean, with a lot of these things, it's sort of the mood changes slowly and then suddenly. Like if you take, like it's sort of what it's like what they say about going into debt. it's a bit of being seriously indebted. It happens slowly, and then suddenly,
Yeah.
suddenly you find yourself destitute. And but that's often. I mean, just to think like with the the miners and the nationalized industries, it was a slow changing of the mood music from the late '60s onwards,
Yeah.
and then suddenly, because it wouldn't bend, it breaks, and
Yeah.
like the privatization was actually far more wide reaching than even sort of Keith Joseph would have imagined in the mid '70s. And you could say actually Brexit is quite similar there, where once it it had been building for 30 years,
Yeah.
British Euroscepticism, and when it finally erupted and finally was done, it was actually far more wide-reaching than even Farage had been articulating in 2016. I think you remember Farage was pro the Norway option in
Yes.
2016, and then within 3 years you had basically, unless you had sort of WTO rules, you weren't a real Brexiteer. Was the it was the sort of rhetoric it got to. But anyway, what we finally ended up with sort of Canada, the Canada
Yeah.
option, of just free trade deal out of every institution except the ECHR. So there is the possibility on that sort of issue, like on the sort of multiculturalism issue, that I think the moon music is changing,
Yeah.
but if there isn't, if people don't play their cards right, then it'll just snap, and it'll end up being, the correction will be quite severe.
Yeah.
I think that is a real potential. But this election is a new development that people did talk about in the noughties as something that could happen. The emergence of Muslim sectarian parties, which is essentially what these independents are.
Yeah.
I think so, and now that's happened. So yeah, definitely a space to watch.
Yeah.
It could, of course, be that they don't do anything, that they just come in and they just take their money and help promote their cousins, and nothing comes of this, and they all lose their seats next election. So and the Gaza issue dissipates, and it all just goes. I don't know enough about the sort of military side of what's happening in Gaza to know how it's likely and how quickly it's likely to end, but I think it will almost certainly be over before 2028.
Oh
Um,
yeah. Yeah.
so I don't think it'll drag on like Vietnam or something. It'll be over one way or the other.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think because without Gaza, I don't know what the other big issues would be for the Muslim community, because they are largely appeased by the British state. I mean, they have their own courts, their own schools, their own councils. That they're able to. I mean, the British police and so on turn a blind eye to a lot of goings on
Yeah.
in these areas. So I'm not actually quite sure what their complaints would be. It's not like France where they actually get like banned from wearing the burqa and stuff like that. They're given basically free reign in Britain. So I don't know what would galvanize them. What would the sort of Muslim vote be, so to speak? I mean, there's no they don't have a claim for reparations or anything like the black community in the States. So yeah, I don't know what the dynamic would be.
I suppose. I suppose in the case it could be not the Gaza war continuing on, but the way it ends. That could produce a lot of continued sort of bitterness.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what you said about earlier about it backfiring on them if they do really turn against Labour, you can just imagine that the issue that will do, if that does happen, the issue that'll cause a turn on will probably be the grooming gangs.
Yeah.
Because you can just imagine that they, let's say Labour that break between them and Labour takes place. Labour can then just turn around and go and order the police to investigate things, and there's a hell of a lot that went on in those particular areas that the Muslim community really doesn't want to be made public, because whilst it won't show that a huge number of men were involved,
Hmm.
it will show a large number of the community actively turning a blind eye to what they knew was going on.
Yes, and we've seen how damaging that can be. Like if you look like the Catholic Church with
Yeah,
the paedophilia scandals. Again, it would have been a tiny minority of priests, but as you say, it's that the whole community went out of its way to protect the institution, and that um, basically, I don't think they've still not really recovered reputationally from that
no,
anywhere where it's happened.
yeah,
Which, and quite rightly, I mean, that is such a basic like test of universal morality of
yeah,
don't let predatory men rape little girls is still little boys is such a basic moral test. It's not really the trolley problem of, oh well, if we do this or that, well, it's pretty ontologically easy, and it's amazing how often these big institutions or big communities just fail it.
yeah,
But yeah, I think you're right. That is an interesting
yeah.
thing that could happen. Yeah, cool.
I thought we would just end for the last 15 minutes. We just talk
Mhm.
about Corbyn as his
Yes.
result, which, just to give people a bit of details, Corbyn was elected as the MP for Islington North, though I'm not sure if it was called that when he first elected in 1983. He's very much a man of the Labour left. He was for decades the protege of Tony Benn, who was sort of the tribune of the Labour left from the late 1970s until, well, you could argue until he died in 2014, 13, pretty much.
Yeah.
And then Corbyn became Labour leader in 2015, led them until 2020. He himself is, before we went live, me and Stephen were talking about him, and we say that he's personally a very sort of probably a very likable man and an old-fashioned English eccentric.
Hmm.
The people he surrounds himself with are a hell of a lot of sinister people. They're um, Islamic terrorists, IRA sympathisers, card-carrying members of the British Communist Party, and so that caused a lot of trouble for him during his leadership. And then, particularly around the issue of anti-Semitism, and there was a report done by the Labour Party in early 2020 after he'd left. Uh, he didn't deny that there was anti-Semitism going on, but his statement about the report was that it had overestimated the
Hmm.
anti-Semitism, and then that was used to sort of initially suspend him from the Labour Party, and they kicked him out. And so he chose to stand in this past general election as an independent, and he won, which is something personally I didn't think he was going to do. I thought he was going to have put up a good fight and get a good chunk of the vote, sort of undermining Labour. But I didn't imagine he'd win. But as you can see here on the results, he won just under 50% of the vote, and the Labour candidate who ran lost just under 30% of Labour's vote in that general election on 2019.
Yeah. No, I was quite pleased for Corbyn. I think, yeah, I think because I mean, I'm not a fan of the parties, kicking people out
Yeah,
um, for like for like ideological reasons. I think, I mean, yeah, as you said, like the people Corbyn surrounded himself with were deeply unpleasant. Um, to put it mildly. Yeah, so and I think he himself, to be honest, I think he's quite a nice man, but I think he's just extremely dim. Um, to be blunt, if you look at his like academic record, his personal statements, and this, interviews and things, really can't think on his feet and sort of
no,
process information, which is largely why he's got the same opinions now that he did when he was 17.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, and he's just sort of sat there, and I think, and of course, he became leader largely by accident. It was, he was just put up with as the sort of hard left candidate for that year.
Yeah.
For 20, and then he ended up winning because of rule changes. But yeah, but no, I'm happy with him there. I think he'll just, to be honest, though, I don't think he'll say anything. I think he'll just continue to be sitting there. You know, he might make the odd comment about Gaza or what have you. But as you said, he'll mostly just do his constituency work, and that's that really. I think it's amazing actually how many of the Corbyn era characters just disappeared off the political sphere
Yeah.
once they lost power. Yeah, McDonnell, even Abbott, you barely hear from her anymore. Long Bailey, like I'd never heard of her before she was put forward as the leadership candidate, and then I've never heard of her since. So I suppose Rayner's still there, of course. Of course, Thornbury is still pottering about, but I don't know if you could call her a Corbynite because she's pretty detested by the other Corbynites.
I think she isn't. I think I'm right in saying she's sort of not liked by quite a lot of people within the Labour Party, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I think she's just personally insufferable.
Yeah.
It's not really down to ideology. She's just, from what I've heard, just extremely arrogant and, just has just very difficult to work with. So yeah, I think it's an interesting that the sort of militant tendency of Labour finally took the reins of power after nearly 100 years. They had their two shots at government, and finally failed spectacularly, and that's it. I think that's sort of it, really, because I think that's it for. It's not been commented on as much as I think it should have been, but that is sort of the end of socialism. I think the actual real socialism in Britain. It is now very likely to go the way of the Jacobites or the diggers or people with these sort of old timey ideologies that just never came to anything. Because I just don't think, from what I've seen of the younger Labour people, they're just not as interested in these issues anymore. Trade unionism. There's talk about phasing in renationalisation of the railways, but in terms of the big, like reorganizing the entire economy to serve the interests of labor, not capital, all that sort of stuff, I think it's old hat now. It was a sort of last gasp with Corbyn, who in many ways actually was standing, when it actually came to the election policies, was to the right of Kinnock in '87. Even though he was portrayed as sort of foot-like, the actual positions they came up with were to the right of Kinnock. I think it's sort of a bit of a damp. It's not really been talked about that much, but I think it's quite interesting that it's an ideology that was absolutely dominant in Britain from sort of the 1890s through till the 1990s. And it's sort of just now fizzling out, because now what the left is really defined as this sort of there's all these various terms for it: progressivism, woke, but basically sort of the bureaucratic left, which is embodied in KISS, the bureaucratic class politics, rather than the Labour class politics of the 19th and 20th centuries. And that's it, that's just sort of fizzled out, and for the time being. Sorry, that's a bit of a somber note, but a sort of it's a sort of as a sort of conservative, it's like it's the passing of an old enemy. But you sort of had built up a grudging respect for, but it's now it's gone. To be honest. And then now we've got a whole new dynamic going on, or emerging, I should say, which will be quite interesting. Anyway, sorry, I'll let you.
I was just going to say, just to add what you said, even when you look at the young support, the sort of youthful support for Corbyn, it was almost all on the cultural issues. It was not really on the economic side. So the only economic thing they were really simply concerned about was tuition fees. All the rest was what's the cultural element, the gender, race, all this sort of stuff. And
Yes,
and you can get that, as you mentioned, the old economic stuff, the idea of nationalisation, the commanding heights of the economy that you would have got from the proper sort of socialist left of 30 years ago.
I mean, even to be honest, even like the anti-globalization stuff of sort of 20 years ago, even that was barely talked about now. They've learned to love globalism.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a yeah. I think that's all I have to say on it. But yeah, it's quite an interesting phenomenon that sort of I think will only be talked about by sort of academic historians. But it seems to have just been forgotten. The sort of the countries just moved on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose I don't know if you want to cover anything else. Should we end it there?
I think we should. Yeah, we can end it there. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, we'll say goodbye, and we will hopefully we'll be back at some point.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I will be out of the country in sort of 2 weeks' time. But I will be back in late August. But yeah, we should get something sorted at some point. Yeah.
Of course. In that case, what I'll do, if you stay on, I'll just end the stream and then we can sort things out afterwards.
Yeah,
so,
cool.
So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'll see you at some point. I'll probably put out a video sometime this week or next week on probably a book review. So you'll see me then. Bye. And if you just bear a second, it's just